What happens when an empire simultaneously faces economic collapse, invading forces, widespread disease, political chaos, and even polluted water? That was Rome in its final centuries. Today, we're unpacking 7 deadly forces that combined to bring down the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. Let's dive in, because this was no one-off disaster, but a perfect storm of crises. Economic crisis and currency debasement. Rome's silver denarius once contained nearly 90% silver in the 1st century AD. By around AD 270, purity plunged to just 2% silver, triggering rampant inflation and a breakdown in economic trust. As coins lost their value, trade slowed and barter re-emerged, because why carry a bag of useless coins when you can trade goats directly? Reforms by emperors like Aurelian and Diocletian, including imposing price controls, offered brief stability, but the underlying trend remained intact. Overexpansion and military overstretch. At its greatest extent, Rome controlled almost 5 million square kilometers, from Britain to Mesopotamia. This required a massive army, around 600,000 troops by Diocletian's era. Maintaining such a force, alongside public infrastructure and long frontiers, drained the imperial treasury. With static revenues, due to declining population and crisis conditions, Rome was effectively running on empty. Barbarian migrations and invasions. From around AD 375, waves of Goths, Vandals, and other tribes were admitted as foederati. But trust broke down, and Rome's underfunded armies couldn't stop them. The Visigoths. In 410 AD, the Visigoths, led by King Alaric, were in central Italy, where they famously sacked Rome. Just before this, they had settled in Illyricum, Western Balkans, after crossing the Danube. In the modern day, these include the parts of Italy, Croatia, Bosnia, and later Spain, after they moved westward and established a kingdom. The Vandals. In 455 AD, the Vandals had crossed from Spain into North Africa, where they controlled Carthage and launched a naval raid to sack Rome. They ruled over areas of present-day Tunisia, Algeria, and parts of Libya. The Ostrogoths. Around 493 AD, the Ostrogoths had taken over Italy, forming their own kingdom under Theodoric the Great after the fall of the Western Empire. Today, their legacy lies mostly within the borders of modern Italy. But if we trace their roots further back, their early homeland was far from the Mediterranean, in the wide steppes of what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. The Huns. Circa 450 AD, under Attila, the Huns were headquartered in the Carpathian Basin, launching campaigns into both the Western and Eastern Roman empires. In the modern day, these primarily include Hungary, with influence spreading into Austria, Romania, and Serbia. Political instability and civil war. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome cycled through more than 20 emperors, most of whom gained power by assassination, rebellion, or military coup, a period now called the crisis of the 3rd century. It kicked off in 235 AD when Emperor Severus Alexander was killed by his own troops, so much for job security. The Praetorian Guard, originally tasked with protecting the emperor, became infamous for auctioning off the throne like it was a used chariot, turning imperial succession into a chaotic bidding war. Meanwhile, powerful local generals grabbed regional control, acting more like warlords than Roman officials. This fractured imperial unity and made any kind of serious reform nearly impossible, unless your reform plan involved more backstabbing and civil war. East to West administrative split. In 286 AD, Emperor Diocletian made a bold administrative move. He formally split the Roman Empire into 2 parts, the Eastern Empire, based in Byzantium, later Constantinople, and the Western Empire, centered in Rome and later Ravenna. This wasn't just geographical, it was also cultural. The East spoke Greek, boasted wealthier cities, and maintained stronger administrative systems. The West, meanwhile, primarily Latin-speaking, struggled with poorer provinces, declining infrastructure, and unstable leadership. While the division aimed to make the vast empire more manageable, it unintentionally weakened the centralized authority that once held Rome together. The East could largely defend and sustain itself, but the West became increasingly vulnerable, left to face barbarian incursions, economic strain, and political collapse with dwindling resources and fractured support. What was meant to stabilize the empire only delayed the inevitable, for half of it. Disease and climate stress. Between 165 and 180 AD, the Antonine Plague, likely smallpox or measles, swept across the Roman Empire, killing an estimated 10% of the population. Entire legions were decimated, cities emptied, and farms went untended. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius himself fell victim to it. With fewer soldiers to defend the borders and fewer farmers to feed the people, the empire's foundations began to wobble. But the trouble didn't end there. In the following centuries, the empire was hit by climate cooling, part of what modern researchers call the late antique Little Ice Age. Colder temperatures shortened growing seasons and slashed agricultural yields, sparking famines and forcing populations to migrate in search of food and stability. Entire regions became less habitable, and the strain on Rome's supply chains intensified. Lead pollution and cognitive decline. Recent ice core studies show that Roman-era mining and smelting released massive amounts of lead into the atmosphere across Europe. Estimated blood lead levels among children were 2 to 5 micrograms per deciliter, which modern epidemiology links to an average 2.5 to 3-point IQ drop. While lead exposure alone couldn't topple empires, diminished cognitive function among elites and administrators likely worsened governance and crisis response. In other words, Rome wasn't just falling, it was also forgetting why it stood up in the first place. When did Rome fall? Many textbooks cite 476 AD, when Romulus Augustulus was deposed, as the end of the Western Roman Empire. But this was primarily a political milestone, the symbolic fall of an emperor who held little real authority. A deeper collapse unfolded between 535 to 562 AD, during Justinian's reconquest of former Western territories. Instead of restoring Roman greatness, these wars shattered the last remnants of Roman administrative systems, especially in Italy and North Africa. This is Rome before the fall, at its peak, organized, expansive, and deeply institutional. This is Rome after the fall, fragmented, hollowed out, and Roman in name only. The final word. Rome's collapse wasn't the result of any single catastrophic event. It was more like a slow-motion avalanche, a cumulative disaster built on layers of economic breakdown, military overreach, barbarian invasions, political fragmentation, public health disasters, climate stress, and environmental toxins. When the water is poisoned and the economy collapses, it's not just infrastructure that starts crumbling, it's people's minds, too. Lead in the pipes didn't just poison bodies, it likely dulled decision-making at every level. Imagine running an empire with widespread cognitive decline. Suddenly every meeting feels like a really dysfunctional group project. Institutions that once held society together became paralyzed, leaders made baffling choices, and chaos crept in like an uninvited guest who refuses to leave. And no, blaming the Visigoths wasn't a sustainable 5-year plan. So where are the Romans now? They're still around, just no longer wearing togas or commanding legions. The descendants of that ancient civilization are the modern Italians, living in the same sun-soaked hills, sipping espresso instead of wine-diluted water, and arguing passionately, but now mostly about football and politics instead of empire and barbarians. Rome may have fallen, but the Romans? They're just getting their morning coffee.